Good morning. All right, let's get started. So as we near the end of the Gospel of John, these next two chapters, 18 and 19, often called the Passion of Christ, the arrest, the betrayal, the mocking and tormenting and putting on trial, and the crucifixion of Christ. Today we look at chapter 18, in which Jesus is arrested. We'll start out with the first 9 verses of chapter 18. After Jesus had said these things, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley where there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas took a company of soldiers and some temple police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing everything that was about to happen to him, went out and said to them, "Who is it you're looking for?" "Jesus the Nazarene," they answered. "I am he," Jesus told them. Judas, who betrayed him, was also standing with them. And when he told them, I am he, they stepped back and fell to the ground. And then he asked them again, "Who is it you're looking for?" "Jesus the Nazarene," they said. "I told you I am he," Jesus replied. "So if you're looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the words he had said, "I have not lost one of those you have given me." So you'll notice that John doesn't actually use the phrase Garden of Gethsemane. He just says the garden across the brook of Kidron. And in many cases we've seen that John understands that his readers have already had access to other Gospels that were written. And John doesn't repeat every story or even every phrase or word because he figures that everyone knows from the other Gospels. And in fact, later in chapter 18, we'll see that John completely skips over a story because he knows that people have already read it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Verse 2 said he had taken the disciples there before and that Judas knew the place. And verse 4 tells us that Jesus knew what was about to happen to him. Now, early Christian commentators took a look at those two verses and said, they emphasized Jesus voluntarily went to his death. He went to a place where Judas, who had already left to betray him, where Judas would be able to come back and find him, and he knew what was going to happen. And it was important theologically to note that it wasn't that Jesus had some ministry that was cut short by getting arrested or something, This wasn't any accident. This wasn't something outside of his control. He deliberately put himself in a place to be found and arrested because that was his mission. He was willingly going to meet his fate. Then we see that Jesus gets taken to the high priest. Verses 10 through 14. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. At that, Jesus said to Peter, "Sheath your sword. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the company of soldiers, the commander, and the Jewish temple police arrested Jesus and tied him up. Some translations say they put him in chains. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was advantageous that one man should die for the people. You'll notice that John makes the parenthetical remark of what the name was of the high priest's slave or servant who had his ear cut off that he restored. And the restoration of the ear is actually in another gospel. Once again, John doesn't repeat all the stories, but John gives a lot of names like that. He has all of the earmarks, you might say, of eyewitness testimony. He remembers which disciple said something or other to Jesus. Instead of just saying, in the other Gospels, they'll say, the disciples asked him. But often John, in telling the same story, like in the feeding of the 5,000, will say, Andrew said, this little boy has loaves and fishes, or Philip asked something. And here he gives the name of Malchus. It's not important, except that it's a testimony that this is an eyewitness who remembers and knew these people and knew their names. Now, this was a theme that John has been highlighting here. Jesus went to a place where Judas could find him, where Judas had been before, and Judas would know to look there. Jesus knew what was going to happen, and Jesus wouldn't let his disciples fight on his behalf because, once again, this is all according to his will. This isn't something that's just happening to him. This is his plan, and so he doesn't want anybody fighting on his behalf. And so early Christian commentators, I like to look back at what they have to say about some of these passages, and they detected a lot of irony, especially in John's phrasing, because here's Jesus being led away in chains, and yet Jesus is a liberator. Jesus is here to set us free from the chains of sin. And if these men who had arrested him had only known, he was there to set them free. And yet they put him in chains. So this was something the early Christians reflected upon. And John here also shows great familiarity with these times. Now we know that the Gospel of John was written down later than the other Gospels. It was late in the first century, maybe in the 80s AD. And yet it keeps having all these signs of someone having eyewitness testimony, someone who was there. And in these days, in the 80s AD, you couldn't go look things up on the internet or an encyclopedia. If you were going to get your facts right, you needed to have been there. And it says that Annas, they took him to Annas, and all he explains is Annas was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest. Well, why do you take Jesus to his father-in-law? That's not really explained, but it's very realistic because Annas was the high priest. Long before this, about AD 6 to 15, Annas was the high priest. And then the Romans removed him from the high priesthood. Now that was a big sore spot with the Jews. Because first of all, the high priest is supposed to serve for life. And secondly, you've got these Gentiles dictating who's going to be high priest. And in fact, one of the causes of friction between the Sadducees, who ran the temple and were in charge and provided the high priest, and the rest of the people, was that the Sadducees kind of sucked up to the Romans in order to get their power, in order to get their authority. And so it was a real sore spot with the Jews. We have to have priests, high priests, who are chosen on the basis that they've been currying favor with Romans. That's not how a high priest should get the position. And when he does get the position, it should be for life. So there's several problems going on here. But what Annas did, which somewhat placated the people, is he kind of worked behind the scenes for the rest of his life to be kind of the puppet master. He had 6 different sons and 1 son-in-law, Caiaphas. And they took turns throughout his lifetime being the high priest. First, there were a couple of his sons for a year each. And then from 18 to 36 AD, it was Caiaphas, the son-in-law. And then after that, it was other sons of Annas on up to 63 AD, when his youngest son, who also had the name Annas, was made high priest, and he only lived a year at that time. But so from 6 AD to 63 AD, it's Annas and his sons and his son-in-law who are high priest. But Annas is kind of pulling the strings behind the scene, and actually most of the Jews appreciated that because they did not appreciate the Romans removing Annas from the priesthood in the first place. So that was fine with them. So why would they take Jesus to the father-in-law of the high priest? Well, it's because they recognized this is the guy who's actually in charge. He's not officially the high priest that year. Caiaphas is. But you don't want Caiaphas making decisions without Annas being part of it. So John shows great familiarity with what was going on in the early 30s AD. Even though this gospel was written in the 80s probably. That's a sign that John, the author, is very familiar, and it's not some later person. Now, we get Peter's first denial of Christ after the arrest, verses 15 through 18. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was following Jesus, as was another disciple. That disciple was an acquaintance of the high priest. So he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter remained standing outside by the door. So the other disciple, the one known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the girl who was the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Then the slave girl, who was the doorkeeper, said to Peter, "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" "I am not," he said. Now the slaves and the temple police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. They were standing there warming themselves, and Peter was standing with them warming himself. Now, the way John arranges things is pretty good chronologically. There's a denial by Peter, and there's Jesus being questioned, and then there's more denials by Peter. And in some of the other Gospels, the 3 denials will all group together topically, which might leave you with the false impression that it was like rapid-fire denials in 20 seconds time. But that's just a kind of a topical arrangement. We see now Peter will switch over to Jesus going before Annas. But we think about the mind of Peter at this point in time. They still don't understand, this has been made very clear in the Gospel of John, they don't understand that Jesus is going to be executed. They're still waiting for the triumphant king. That's their picture of the Messiah. So how could being arrested fit into that? This is very confusing to the disciples, and I'm sure it's very confusing to Peter. And they aren't going to understand. This is repeated throughout John. We've seen they're not going to understand everything until the resurrection. Jesus is going to appear to them after the resurrection. Then they're going to be talked to by Jesus. He's going to explain how he's the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies. Then they're going to understand. But right now, they still don't understand, including Peter. So I think Peter was simply tempted He was afraid. He was tempted to avoid getting arrested himself and maybe executed himself. And I think he denied Jesus for a very simple reason. He was afraid. He thought he'd better deny so he doesn't get arrested like Jesus just got arrested. But think about this. What do you think would have happened if Peter had said, yes, I'm one of his disciples? You think he would have been executed? That's what he was afraid of, but is that really what would have happened? No. They wanted to kill Jesus. But it takes quite a bit of faith to say, we look forward into the book of Acts. Peter gets arrested in the book of Acts, and they do want to kill him. But God turns him loose. Right? It takes a lot of faith to say, I'm in God's hands. I'm not worried about getting arrested. So, there's kind of a lesson there for us. How easy is it to worry and to be fearful instead of just saying, I trust God? Peter ideally would have said, everything's in God's hands. I'm not worried about whatever happens. But it's kind of hard to be that way, isn't it? God didn't allow Peter to be executed in the book of Acts because that was not part of his plan for the church. But Peter doesn't yet have quite that faith yet to simply say, I'm not worried. After he's transformed by seeing the resurrected Jesus, we see a Peter in the book of Acts who is hauled before the authorities and told, you're going to stop preaching this or else. And he says, Acts 4:32, we ought to obey God rather than men. That's a Peter who's been transformed, isn't it, from the Peter that we see right here denying Christ. What transformed him? It must have been the resurrection of Christ. The crucifixion, the resurrection, and the post-resurrection appearances to the disciples turned Peter from this fearful man into a man who could go before the powerful authorities and say, no, I'm not going to stop preaching the gospel, no matter what you say. Now we see Jesus being questioned by Annas. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. I have spoken openly to the world. Jesus answered him, I have always taught in the synagogue and in the temple complex where all the Jews congregate, and I haven't spoken anything in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who heard what I told them. Look, they know what I said. When he had said these things, one of the temple police standing by slapped Jesus, saying, is this the way you answer the high priest? Notice he refers to Annas as the high priest. If I have spoken wrongly, Jesus answered him, give evidence about the wrong. But if rightly, why do you hit me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now you notice they also call Caiaphas the high priest. They were considered both the high priest in some sense, right? One of them was unofficial, but Jesus, you'll note, he's not, throughout his whole ordeal here of being tried, look in all the Gospels, he's not trying to argue, you should turn me loose. He doesn't want to be turned loose. He wants to be crucified. But even so, he can't resist saying, look, I'm going to defend my integrity. I'm not a false teacher who goes around in secret whispering to people when the authorities can't hear. Why are you asking me what my teachings are? I stood there in the temple complex in public in front of crowds, many of whom you could talk to right now, and I taught. And I taught openly in the synagogues up in Galilee. There's no secret here. I'm not hiding anything. Now, that's not an argument you should set me free. That's simply a response. What is this stuff that you're teaching? You want to know what I'm teaching? Just ask the countless people that I taught in public, because I don't keep secrets or do secret teachings. This is not some mystery religion or something. This is not some plot that has to be kept secret. This is open teaching of the truth. So, once again, John accurately reflects that both Annas and Caiaphas are actually considered the high priest. One of them's unofficially the high priest, and one of them's officially the high priest. Now, we get the final two denials of Jesus by Peter. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and they said to him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the high priest's slaves, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. Now, one thing you'll notice that in the Gospel of Mark, you get a lot more detail than this, for example, really in any gospel. John knows that his readers are familiar with the denials of Jesus, and these are very brief recounting of the denial, whereas there's quite a bit of detail in the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is based upon Mark recording Peter's preaching. And so they record a lot of Peter's anguish over denying Christ, hearing the rooster crow, realizing what he's done. And John is just kind of flying through it because that story's already been told. But I think it's also significant that when Peter tells the story in the Gospel of Mark, Peter doesn't leave out any detail of how bad it was and how bad he felt, which kind of, to me, gives the Gospel of Mark a feeling of authenticity. This really was the teaching of Peter. The most detail, the worst Peter looks, you might say, is in the Gospel of Mark. He doesn't shy away from what he's done here in his denials. Now they're going to take Jesus to Pilate. But one of the interesting things here is that there's a story skipped over completely. See if you can spot it. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They did not enter the headquarters themselves, otherwise they would be defiled and unable to eat the Passover. You don't go into the Gentiles' houses because you'd have to go through a period of cleansing, and if it's the day of the Passover, then you don't want to miss the communal meals and so on because you became unclean. So they're standing outside of Pilate's governor's house. Then Pilate came out to them and said, "What charge do you bring against this man?" And they answered him, "If this man weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over to you." I'm unimpressed by the logic here. What is this man guilty of? Well, if he weren't guilty, we wouldn't have brought him here. With that logic, I guess you could convict anybody of anything. Pilate told them, "Well, take him yourselves, judge him according to your law." Pilate realizes this is some sort of Jewish religious dispute, and he doesn't really want to get into the middle of that. But then they reveal why they're here. It's not legal for us to put anyone to death, the Jews declared. So they're here to get Pilate to execute Jesus. And in order to do so, they need to make Pilate afraid of Jesus that Jesus is, quote, King of the Jews, that sounds like maybe he's leading a rebellion against the Romans, and now the Romans, instead of treating it like an internal religious dispute among Jews, will treat it as something that they do care about, enough to execute Jesus. You notice what he had skipped over? We just took Jesus to Caiaphas in the middle of the night, midnight or something, and then it says, in the morning, they took him from Caiaphas' house over to Pilate. In the other Gospels, you have these very long, important stories of Jesus standing trial before Caiaphas with false witnesses brought up against him, saying false things, but they can't agree with each other, and so on. And finally, Caiaphas is baiting him to say, to declare himself divine. And when he does so, he tears his clothes and says, you've heard it yourself, that's blasphemy. What more need do we have of witnesses? And so on. All of that is skipped over by John because John assumes you've already got Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I'm not retelling every story from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm teaching some things that are more advanced and more difficult to understand, and so I'm not going to repeat everything. The Jews reveal, we brought him here because we want him killed. We can't do that. The power to execute was taken away by the Roman government. And they've got to make Pilate think Jesus is a threat if they want to get Pilate to execute him. And so Pilate seems very exasperated, and he goes back into the headquarters, summoned Jesus, said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered, are you asking this on your own, or have others told you about me? Pilate says, I'm not a Jew, am I? And he seems very exasperated by this whole thing. I'm supposed to sort this out. I've never met Jesus before. I'm not a Jew. I don't understand their religious disputes. He doesn't know what to do about this. But your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done? Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom doesn't have its origin here. You are a king then? Pilate asked. You say that I'm a king. That's an idiom in the language of the time saying, you said it. In other words, you're speaking the truth. So Jesus is admitting, yeah, I'm a king. I was born for this, and I've come into the world for this to testify to the truth. Everyone who's of the truth listens to my voice. What is truth, says Pilate. A lot of times people try to make that into some sort of statement of moral relativism or something by Pilate, what's truth? I think it's just exasperation. What is the truth here? What's going on here? I'm a Roman. I don't know what this problem is in the first place. And there's one detail I'm going to finish with. I mentioned a year ago how when eyewitnesses testify about something, different eyewitnesses, they don't say the exact same things, but they tend to explain each other unintentionally, and that's one of the hallmarks of authenticity of eyewitness testimony. And that's the case with the eyewitnesses that Luke interviewed, and with John, the eyewitness in this story. Pilate, in Luke chapter 23, Luke has less of the language here and says, Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? And he says, you said it. Pilate then told the chief priests and the crowds, I find no grounds for charging this man. Now that's very odd because the one thing that a Roman governor would be concerned about is a rival king. And when you read Luke, it says, his response was, for Jesus saying, yeah, I'm the king of the Jews, is to simply turn around and say, I find no grounds for charging this man. But actually what John tells us with by giving more detail, is there's a reason that Pilate didn't react negatively, because Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world, and I don't ask my followers to fight on my behalf." And that's why Pilate isn't worried. That's why even when Jesus says, "Yes, I'm the king of the Jews," when Jesus makes it clear that my kingdom is not like that. I don't have soldiers fighting for me. Don't worry about that. Then Pilate isn't worried. And so the two Gospels fit together and explain each other without any conscious attempt to explain each other, just because that's the way eyewitness testimony tends to work. So next week we'll see in chapter 19 the crucifixion.